welcome back to the channel, folks. This video is about pin washing. Now, if you're familiar with my videos, you will have seen me doing pin washing on my tanks as the way of doing shading. Instead of applying a wash all over the entire vehicle, it's applying it into and around all the features, panel lines and vision ports and such likes. This here being a good example. Now, in the past, I've always used enamel pin washes because they have the degree of sort of fluidity that's required to flow around all the various bits of details as opposed to just spread over the surface. You may be familiar with the process, but I'll just get a quick recap. You give this a coat of gloss varnish, which makes a very smooth surface, which allows this very fluid product with capillary action to follow all the various details. And then when it's had a chance to dry a little bit, you clean it off using some thinner. And typically I would thin this down with thinner as well. And then in terms of weathering, you can also be using enamel products. There's lots and lots out there, guys. This is just one example, a brown one, to create streaking, and there's dusting and all kind of things that you can be doing. But over the years of doing this, especially if I'm painting a lot of tanks, whether you're using odorless thinner or not, you're working with a lot of fumes, and it can get quite tiresome, quite wearisome, can maybe even give yourself a bit of a sore head if you're painting too much. So the one thing that I always wanted to find, and there's been kind of like, from my experience, false starts in the past, the one thing I always wanted to find was an acrylic pin wash. And this, let me see, it's Mig Ammo pin wash, is the game changer for me, guys. This is going to replace all of the enamel pin wash that I have been using. The enamel weathering too, the range is quite large, quite sufficient for all your needs. Here's a dust wash, for instance. If you've seen me painting the Spearhead box set recently, you will have had a look at me using these acrylic pin washes. But this video, I'm going to show you in detail. I'm going to spend some time to go through the steps that I would normally do with acrylics. I'm going to go through those steps with the pin wash, and hopefully you're going to see how it's just as effective, the acrylics, just as effective as the enamels, and it's so much more comfortable and easier to use in terms of the cleanup, but also just the odours and the smells and such like. As with enamels, I'm going to work with a palette. I'm going to have a little pool of the unthinned wash and then 2 little pools of water. One of those pools I will add unthinned wash to until I've got the consistency that I'm after. And you'll be able to see quite clearly from the pictures here, it's just a nice thin version of what comes out of the bottle. And then we'll start working, folks. Let's just take a bit of time to see me applying this. The easiest areas to get this wash into are the edges, the recesses of panels. You can see me, I'm constantly stirring the mix that I've prepared on the palette. It just stops the main pigments separating from each other when they're sitting there. And hopefully you can see here on the video, folks, how easy this is to control. I'm using a long thin brush just because it's easier to work around the panels with it, and I'm just following those lines, and the wash it's doing everything we would expect an enamel wash to do. It's just capillary action over the gloss surface and flowing into lines and around objects. Very, very easy to control, and certainly right away I can see less cleanup needed than I would see with enamels. So I'll just speed things up a bit here. And I'm really happy with the level of control that you can see here. I mean, that cupola is a very complicated shape, but it's possible to get the washes into all the recesses without making the flatter areas too dark. It's very, very, very practical to use. Even if you're not familiar with doing pin washes, this would be the way to start rather than enamels. Let's move on to the hull of the Chaffee here. Taking a bit of time over the grills. They are a large darker area, you may have to apply a couple of coats. And then just following around all the little lines in the panels again, and you can see how easy it's going on there, folks. Bear in mind I'm still continually mixing up the wash that's sitting on the palette, adding more water and more wash as is required. And hopefully you can still see the real sense of control you've got with this wash, folks. It's going where I want it to go. Because the pigment is not as grainy as you find with the enamel washes, you've got that finer level of control, I find, and any bleeding from the wash is much more easy to control and to clean up than an enamel wash. Okay, we're going to do some tidy up now. Now, it's recommended you don't wait any longer than 10 minutes before tidying up. I personally would typically do the whole turret, maybe then do another turret, and in that time the first turret will be dry, and by the time you get to the second turret it will be dry. But basically wait until it is visibly dry and no more. It's only a few minutes, folks, it doesn't take long. And then we can take an old brush, nothing too big, just enough to hold a little bit of moisture in the form of some water, and draw off any excesses that are sitting on these flat surfaces. Draw into the features because it will reactivate, so you can draw into a recess, into a detail, or you can draw off the flat surface altogether. Bear in mind you need to refresh your brush when you're doing this, folks, otherwise you're going to start dragging around the paint that you've lifted off. So maybe have a little tissue, or do what I do is like maybe wipe it on your thumb and then refresh it a little bit in the water. But keep an eye on what you're doing. Make sure the brush is sufficiently clean, that you've got complete control and you're not just sort of mixing mud. And compared to the enamels, folks, I do find this quicker, and you know, it's a lot less smelly. Even if you're using odorless thinners, you know, you're still using a thinner, you know, a chemical, whereas here we're working with nice clean water and getting some nice clean results. And you can see those flat areas, folks, they really are coming up nice and bright. Let's see that again, folks, except this time with a Sherman tank, just to see a different shape and just reinforce what we've seen so far. So you can see me mixing it up, getting the right consistency. When I'm applying a pin wash, I'm not going to work straight out of the bottle, and you can see it going into that angle of the fender there, very, very neatly following the angles. And then on the engine deck we've got lots of detail here, and you can see how there's no great loss of control, there's no spillage going everywhere. It's doing what you would expect from an enamel pin wash. You've got the level of control you would expect to see. And in terms of getting ready for cleanup, by the way, folks, this is quite a big vehicle, the tank, so typically when you're finished you're almost ready to start the cleanup straight away on the areas you started on first. But remember, if you see it looking wet and looking shiny, then it's too early to start cleaning it up, or you're going to start drawing too much paint around. You just want to clean it up, not draw paint around. Let's have a look at the turret now, and you can see how it's picking out the hatches, all those tiny little bits of details and vision vision slots and little hooks and like the loader's hatch there. You've got plenty of control on this, folks. You can, for the areas where you want to really paint something in, just use some unthinned wash and you're still going to keep that control. Now let's take a look at using the dust wash. I'm going to be using it for dusting and for streaking. But see the hull sides on these sort of flat tub-like Shermans, they're very dull. It's hard to do anything with them because they're so flat. So I'm using that Vallejo Earth Effects to add just a little bit of roughness to the hull. I'm not wanting to cover it in mud. That's just going to look very unattractive, particularly at this scale. But apply a thin coat, leave it to dry, and you're going to have a nice rough surface that will hold the dust wash, as you can see there. And you can spend as much or as little time on those areas of the hull as you want. I'm just going to be covering the lower hull quite roughly in a dust wash with a little bit of the dark brown added just to tone it down a little bit, and then I'm going to wash it off to the level of dust that I want to see on the lower hull. You can apply it roughly but then carefully wash it off, and you've still got that level of control to achieve the look that you're after with this water-based wash. Let's move on to the upper hull. So I'm starting with putting some dust on the flat areas, dust that has settled onto the hull. And you don't want to go completely mad with this, folks. You still want to be able to see the shade, for instance, that you have applied. And remember to leave it at least a day before you start applying another wash on top of the shade, or you may find it starts to mix. Now I'm doing various things here. I'm putting the dust on the flat areas, but I'm also getting ready to do some streaking by hitting the tops of panels. So here I tend not to let it dry so much when I'm dusting. I'm just going to go straight on, working small areas at a time, straight on to the thinning and cleaning of it, brushing it back into recessed areas, for instance on the flat points, into the supports there. And then for streaking, I'm first of all going to just knock back the amount of the wash a little bit towards the top of panels and then draw it down. You can see me splitting the tank once again into little areas, getting the level that I'm after in terms of the level of wash that's on it. Also serves to brighten top edges if you want that look, folks. And then start drawing it down using various sizes of thickness, for instance, of brushes to draw it down, and that's going to create my initial streaks. But then I need to soften these streaks down, so I'll use a thicker brush just to hit them, drawing them up, drawing them down, in different directions, but thinning down the streaks so they're not too stark. And I'm using quite thin paint here, folks, but it is possible to use, for instance here, thicker paint. When I say thicker paint, I mean thicker wash that's not been thinned much. You see me just prepping it a bit, pushing it towards that top edge, and then here I'm just using a thicker brush, not the thinnest possible brush that I would use for the panels, for instance, for the pin wash, and I'm just pulling it down, and you can see it's creating a nice soft streaky look. And then keep working it where required, draw down more lines where required, soften those lines, and then also maybe push any excess wash that's sitting towards the top of the panels, push it away, push it up the way. Your brush will pick it up and take it off. And then here I'm just doing a bit more work elsewhere where I want to see some dusting, and I'll follow the same approach as before there. Let's see that again on the Sherman. So putting some unthinned wash straight out the bottle onto the top edge, cleaning my brush, and then softening that edge down. That will reduce the amount of paint that's on there and give us a nice soft edge to start with. And you see me splitting the hull into different areas again based on the major components. And then starting to draw down, cleaning my brush as I go so that I can then, if you imagine, draw the line down and then soften the line that I've just drawn. and this is a process that you can work on for quite some time because the paint is so manageable. So if there is too much streaking, clean your brush, draw it away. If there's not enough, go to the palette, add a little bit more wash to your brush and then draw it down. Use different size of brushes as well, thin brushes, thick brushes, thin for creating the lines, thick for softer lines or for softening those thin lines that you put on. Don't overdo it, folks. You'll get a streaky look without having to make it look like a zebra, if you understand. Some thin lines, some thick lines together will create the mix that will give you the right overall impression. And on the sides we'll do similar to the chaffé. Apply some of that unthinned wash, manage the amount of paint that's on there and then draw it down. And you can see how that's softening the look of the hull. It's adding another level to the patina of the modulation that was painted on. And we have got real good levels of control here, folks, but it's kind of like cooking. By that I mean you can always add more salt to something you're cooking, but you can't take it out. Up to a point, when you're adding streaks and weathering to a tank, you can always add more, but it's very difficult to take it out again. So build up, you know. Don't go too heavy. Just put on an amount, see how it looks. If it needs more, add more. If it looks as though it's right, fine, you've got it. But you don't want to be adding on a hell of a lot and then just drowning the tank in the effect. That is a very common mistake to make when you're starting weathering. Let's see how we work the turret. It's got a lot of smaller areas, so we're going to follow the same approach, but we're just going to use an appropriate amount of paint and an appropriate amount of streaking as well. We don't want to dominate this smaller area, but it still needs to be weathered because it's existing in the same world and going to the same places as the hull. And we're just following the same again, managing the starting point, which is that top edge of the turret that you can see, working around any stowage that there may be. We don't want areas that look too clean. And then on the flat surfaces again, we can just apply some paint straight away, soften it down, and we'll get a nice dusty look to that flat area. And that is us done, folks. That's a look at the finished tank. I've got plenty of stills coming up as well. I hope you found that useful, folks. If you're experienced with using enamels, maybe this video will give you a wee spark to try out this product. If you've not tackled pin washing before, maybe because you don't like enamels, this may well be the product for you, folks. It certainly is a product that I've been waiting for, and I'm very glad that Mig Ammo have brought it out. Anyway, that's the video now, folks. Thanks for watching, and I'd just like to say thanks again to all the subscribers out there, and if you'd like to subscribe, please do so. It'll help me bring these kind of videos to the Flames of War community, and hit the bell button, folks, and I'll definitely see you on the next one.